This video goes over an example Java program that includes both value or primitive parameters and also reference typed parameters. We're going to look at the difference in how these are handled by the program. So you have an example program in your notes. I'm going to pull it up in IntelliJ so that we can look at it there. And we're going to trace through the program by hand using a memory worksheet. That's what we usually create on the whiteboard, where we have the memory data, and then we also show the output from the program. We kind of track that as we're executing through the program line by line. So remember that in Java, everything always starts with the main method. So the first line in this main method says we should set up a variable called number, and it's a primitive data type. We can tell because it's an integer. So over in my memory, I created two different spaces because we have the main method, and then we also have the example method that's down at the bottom. So we're going to need two different scopes, one that's for main and then one that's for the example method. I'm going to label this one main. And in here, I'm going to create my variable number. That's a primitive, and it stores the value 5. And then I'm also going to create my second variable that's listed here, list, and that's a reference data type. I can tell because it's an array, and arrays are always reference data types. So that means that when the computer sees the word list in my program, it actually thinks about the memory address that's associated with that. So let's make a hexadecimal number that we can use to mean the memory address of list. So we'll say that's 3C9. And then what goes on is somewhere in the computer's memory, it creates that memory location 3C9, and that's where it's going to store my array of data. So I'm going to set up a table that shows my data values for the array. So there's 4 columns, and it's 1 row total. So that'll be my information that's associated with that memory location. And I'm storing the values 1, 2, 3, and 4 inside that array. So the next thing that happens in the computer's this program is that we encounter this print statement. It says to print to standard output in main before method call. So we're just keeping track of that. Right now we're in main, it's before the method call. The next line tells us to print out the value of number, and that is 5. Word is being super helpful here and capitalizing stuff that I don't want to capitalize. Okay, so we set up the number, it's 5, and printed that out. Now the next thing we have in here is a loop. It goes through for I equals 0, I is less than the length of the list. So it's going to repeat 4 times. And each time it's going to print the list at index I and then a space. So it's going to print out the contents of this list all on one line. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there's a new line printed after that. So we're moving to the next line. So I was just tracing through, kind of keeping track of like, these are the current values in those variables. We displayed all of that to output. So the next line in the program, that's where all the excitement happens. This is our method call to the example method. So this is where the computer's going to transition down to this other algorithm. And we're telling it to pass in these 2 arguments, list and number. And we learned that those are going to get matched up with the parameters that are part of the example method. So list is going to get matched up with array, and number is going to get matched up with num. And down here, I have these square brackets after the array. It's actually going to work just fine if we move them over in front of it, which is where we normally put it. If you happen to put them at the end, it works just fine too. Does the same thing. So in both cases, it knows that list is an integer array, and the second argument, number, is an integer, and num is an integer. So the data types of both parameters and arguments match up well. So we're going to be able to successfully call this method. It won't give us a compilation error or anything. And what happens is we're like transitioning to this example method. And the computer says, hey, I need to set up the value for array, and I need to set up the value for num. And it knows that it should get the value of array by copying the contents of the list. So remember, when the computer sees list, it thinks 3C9. So when it creates the array, it's going to reference that same memory location, 3C9. Whenever we pass in a primitive data type, it's going to copy the information that was in the box of the argument. So inside the box for number is 5. So it's going to copy the value 5 down here for num. Again, that's the primary difference between primitive types and reference types. When you pass a primitive type into a method, you get a copy of it. When you pass a reference type into a method, you get the original memory location. All right, so now that the program has those two parameters initialized, it's ready to start executing the method body. So it's everything down here from the curly bracket down to the return statement. This one doesn't have a return because it's a void method, but from this opening curly bracket down to the closing curly bracket. So the first thing that happens inside the method is this print statement. It's going to print out in example before code. Again, that's just a little message to us so that we remember, like, hey, this is what was going on when these values printed. And now it's going to print out num and then the value of num. So the value of num, that's 5. It's going to print that out. And then we have this array down here. It's going to go from 0 to the length of the array. And that's going to print the contents of the array at position index and then a space. So it's printing out the contents of the array with spaces in between the elements. So when we reference the array inside the example method, it's going to reference the same memory location, 3C9. And even though that's back up in the main method or associated with the main method, it's still going to be able to reference that. And so when we print out that information, it's going to go to the array that's at this location, 3C9, and it's going to get the value at index 0, 1, 2, and 3, and print those to the screen with spaces in between those. And then after it's done with that, it's going to print out a new line, so we'll move to the next line. The next thing that happens in here is we're going to change the value of num. So we're saying num gets a new value. It gets the current value of num times 2. So the current value of num is 5. 5 times 2 is 10, and it's going to store the number 10 back in my variable num. Then I'm going to go through for index equals 0. While it's less than the length of the array, we're going to set the array at position index, so 0, 1, 2, and 3, equal to that new value num. So again, when we access the array, we're always referencing this memory location, 3C9. So it's going to go to location 3C9, and then it's storing that new value num in each of these memory locations. So it's replacing the previous values in the array with the number 10. That's the current value of num. Now it's going to print out this next message saying that we're still in the example method. Now we're after the code is completed, and we want to print out the value of num. It's equal to 10. That's the number that's stored in there. And then we got our array that prints out the contents of the array going from index 0 through 3. It's going to print out the contents of an array, sees the variable array, it goes to memory location 3C9, and it is going to take the individual values there and print them with spaces in between them. So it's going to print 10 space 10 space 10 space 10. And then it's going to print the new line character after that. And at this point, we're at the end of the method. When we reach the end of the curly bracket for the method, everything about the data that was defined inside the scope of the method goes away. When we're returning to the main program, kind of like our memory of what happened in here disappears. So anything that was a copy is no longer maintained. All of that data goes away, and now we're returning to the main program at the point where the method was called. So we're picking up right here after this curly, or after the semicolon, Next thing that's going to happen in our program is it's going to print out in main after method call. In main after method call. And then it's going to print out my variable number equals, and then the value of number. Now look, the 10 that we had before, it's gone away. That was just locally copied and part of the example method. But now we're back in main. The original value that was a number is unchanged, so it's going to print number equals 5. Then it's going to go through this loop where it prints out the contents of the array list. And when it sees the variable list, it thinks 3C9. So it's going to that memory location 3C9. It's going to print out the value 10 space 10 space 10 space 10, the contents of that array, followed by a new line character. So it'll move to the next line. So the effect of calling that example method, when we called it with a primitive value, it made a copy of that value, and changes that were made to that copy were local just to that copy. We made the change in the example. You can see the num value got modified. But then after the call completed and we went back up to the main program, our original value was still there. On the other hand, when we passed a reference variable into the method, we had our list 1, 2, 3, 4 that got passed in and matched up with array. We made changes to the array value down here inside the example method. Then when we returned to the main program, because we were referencing that same memory location, those changes were maintained and the original values were not returned. So again, when you're using a value or a primitive data type, the changes that you make to that particular variable inside your method don't stick. But if you want to pass information back to the main program, then one way to do that is through a return type. The other way to do that is by passing it as a reference data type. If you use multiple parameters that are reference types, you can return multiple values from a single method. And that's pretty cool.